It may not surprise you that Americans' trust in news media is low, and it certainly isn't a secret that there's been a serious decline in our collective ability to have real, robust political debate in this country. So what's the connection between these two trends, and how do we fix it?
I wouldn't say it's dead, but it's certainly headed in a direction that is not healthy for the country and for us as individuals.
On this episode, we sit down with a 20-year veteran of the broadcast news industry for a status check on the state of public discourse in this country. We also talk about the news media and how it's fulfilling its core role to the country, and what each of us can do to revive healthy, respectful, robust debate. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and my guest this week is Glen Mills. He's a former TV and news anchor and political reporter with a couple decades of experience, and we're here to talk about sort of the state of public discourse and the state of the news industry generally. So Glen, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Yeah, happy to be here. Glad we could finally make it happen.
Likewise. And you know, for our listeners' benefit, you and I have known each other for a while. I've been able to work together in a number of capacities. My past work in government PR, working with you as other members of the Utah Press Corps. And so I want to preface this conversation by mentioning that in my experience, the Utah Press Corps is good. On average, there are a lot of dedicated journalists in the state. They're friendly and responsive and trying to do a good job. And you're certainly one of those that got the pleasure to work with over the years. So I want to kind of lead off this conversation by asking about the state of public discourse today. It's easy to look at social media and cable news and conclude that as a society, we are just bad at public debate. We've forgotten how to do it. You know, people are more interested in personal attacks or character assassinations or sound bites than true discourse. And so I want to sort of start with that, I guess, a little bit of a dramatic question. Is public discourse dead in this country?
I wouldn't say it's dead, but it's certainly headed in a direction that is not healthy for the country and for us as individuals. I do believe the majority of people can still have a conversation between themselves, you know, between two people, and be respectful and courteous when doing so. It's just that the extreme we talk about and the vitriol, that's what grabs all the attention and all the headlines.
So Glen, you've been doing this, and you recently transitioned out of the broadcast industry. We might get into your new role a little bit later, but you know, you have over 20 years of experience. And in the time that you've been doing this, you know, what changes have you seen? I mean, thinking back to your early days, I know you've covered news and weather and sports. You've kind of done everything in a number of different states. But what has changed in your view in how we debate and discuss politics or policy ideas publicly in the last 20 years?
Well, first and foremost, I think people have become emboldened to be more on the aggressive and the vitriolic side. And I personally attribute that to the rise and use of social media. People got to the point where they were willing to say anything they wanted to behind a keyboard, and in most instances, they would never say that to the person's face. However, we've started to see that come around as well, where people are willing to say it right to someone's face now. One example recently would be what took place in Orem City with the mayor there after a council meeting. He was spit on and assaulted, allegedly, by an individual. And, you know, we're seeing that more and more. We saw Mitt Romney comes to mind at the airport being confronted by someone with a video camera. So we've definitely seen people become more emboldened in their willingness to confront people, I think.
Do you think, it seems to me that one of the shifts has been, we've moved from saying, well, you're wrong on this issue, I disagree with you on this issue. And then we now, more often than not, interpret that as you are evil or you are bad, not just that you're wrong. And I think sometimes maybe that emboldened feeling, people feel that, well, if I'm fighting against evil, not just something that's wrong, then sort of nothing is off limits in defense of my righteous position. is that an okay way to sort of frame the psychology shift?
I think so. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's an important point. We've gotten to the point with some people that nothing is off limits. But again, I want to get to this point where I think most people are capable of having a respectful conversation with each other. And back on when I was in the news media, I had a weekly political show. That was always my expectation, is that when my guests would come on, they can disagree passionately. There's nothing wrong with that. Attack the idea, but I always demanded respect between individuals. And I think, and most people, who were watching the show on a regular basis would probably agree, we did maintain a respectful platform where we were able to debate ideas and leave the personal attacks out. Now, there were some guests that would probably push the limits a little more than others, but still, in most cases, it was just a friendly jab and a respectful conversation. So I do believe, call me naive, but I do believe that is still something we can achieve here in our country. And again, I think the majority of people are capable of doing that.
Well, let's dig into that for a second. For our listeners' benefit, so your experience, you were at channel ABC4 here in Utah and hosted the Inside Utah Politics show with them. It's one that over the years I had the opportunity to go on. Other people I worked with were able to go on. Occasionally we'd have folks from Sutherland go on. And I think your characterization is right, that it was a place where there was genuine discussion. There have been a number of times over the years when I've watched guests on that show you hosted and thought, on Twitter, they would be a lot more mean to each other than they are in person on your show. Why is there that difference?
I don't know. Like I mentioned earlier, there's just this sense when you're not facing someone and you're typing on a keyboard that you're more emboldened, you're more willing to say something to someone in that scenario, in that environment, as opposed to being face to face with that person. And I agree with you. Like there were times I would have guests on, and based off of what I would see on social media, I'd think, wow, this is going to be fireworks here. And it was just a completely different result, though, when you're face to face and you're in a platform that's kind of known for more respectful conversation. But I saw that difference a lot. There was a persona of someone on the social media side versus what I saw on my show.
Did you ever think at times, I need you guys to jazz it up a little bit more?
Yeah, actually,
we need some back and forth.
Because obviously good TV requires, some of that. So there were times I thought, I was just expecting a little bit more out of, this person than what I saw that day.
It brings up an interesting point, Glenn, because there's a big discussion nationally right now, as well as here in Utah, thanks to Governor Spencer Cox, about how to disagree better. Mm-hmm. It's his chief initiative with the National Governors Association, with his role there. And there are a lot of sort of parallel efforts in that space. There's the Dignity Index. There are just a lot of folks and a lot of voices saying we need to learn how to disagree better. And so I want to ask you, one, does it seem like we have lost that? Maybe we never had it. Maybe we're kind of nostalgic for a time that didn't exist. But it seemed like there have been examples in the past of people being able to disagree vehemently but respectfully. You look at members of the United States Supreme Court. Some of the stories coming out of there, that there's a lot of disagreement, but a lot of collegiality. You look at Senator Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy.
That was an example I was going to bring up. Yep.
So why do you think that we have sort of this history as a country of we knew how to disagree better, but we don't now. But at the same time, we don't want to become so squishy, I guess, that we never say anything of substance. So what's the balance?
Well, a couple of points there. Governor Cox talks in his Disagree Better initiative about this majority, and it's something I've referred to here as well. A majority of Americans are sick and tired of the discourse we're seeing coming from the extremes, the fringe. The extreme and fringe seem to be dominating the discourse, or at least what we're hearing anyway. But again, there's just this majority of people that are tired of this and want to see a better way. Right now in Congress, on both sides, we have the slimmest of majorities in both chambers, and that sets up this dynamic where the more extreme fringe voice has more power than they would otherwise. We saw that with the ousting of Speaker McCarthy recently. So there's just a lot of, in my opinion, domination in the media and on the airwaves of these extreme ideas that are really kind of getting the focus when it comes to public discourse.
So we need to take a break in a minute, but I want to ask you before we go to the next segment, what's the answer? How can someone like me or like our listeners who say, well, I believe in a set of ideas, a set of principles. That's kind of the theme of the show. Let's equip people with the ability to defend the ideas they believe in. I happen to be a political conservative, and I, of course, want those ideas to be successful, but there are people who disagree with me on the other side who I love and respect immensely, even if I don't agree with them. And so what's sort of the magic formula for better discourse for someone to say, well, I want to defend these things I believe in. I want to still discuss and argue and disagree, but do it in a better way. How do I do both of those at the same time, be respectful, without feeling like I have to cede ground on the things I fundamentally believe in?
Well, I don't think you do have to cede ground. I think you can passionately argue what you believe in and debate the ideas. Go after, go to punches when it comes to ideas, but when it comes to the person, that's where I think we can do better. It doesn't need to be personal all the time. We don't need to turn every little political argument or disagreement personal. You mentioned, we're to this point where if you don't agree with me politically, then you're evil. We don't have to think that way. We have to shift that mindset and realize that at the end of the day, that is someone you respect and it is someone you love. And there's no problem or there's no issue with debating those ideas. That's basically what our country is founded on. It goes all the way back. It's something we've seen over time. It's just we got to get to the point where we can not take it personal and leave the personal jabs out of it, in my opinion.
Well, one final quick question to tack on before we go to break. Where can people go to see this kind of healthy debate and discourse modeled? Certainly it doesn't feel like it's the presidential debates.
No.
But obviously the show you hosted, where else should people be looking for modeling of healthy, good debate?
Yeah. I think there are still some local shows and local podcasts that are good examples of that. Stop by the state capitol, drop into a committee hearing, watch a floor debate, and you'll see, for the most part, very healthy debate, a complete difference from what you'll see in the nation's capital. So there are lots of ways and platforms that you can still see that today. You just have to know where to find them.
I'll underscore that. I think a lot of folks may not know that you can tune in to every floor debate and with video, and then the committee debates with audio,
right.
Or you can go in person and watch and even testify. There's an openness to the public involvement, to the legislative process here in Utah that folks may not be aware of. So I think You're right. That's a good place to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come right back, I want to talk about sort of your observations of the news media specifically over 20 years of a career there. Kind of give us a check of how it's doing and maybe what are some things that we as consumers of news media should look for as far as improvement in that industry. So we'll be right back. You're listening to Defending Ideas.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we continue with our conversation with Glen Mills about the state of public discourse and the state of the news media today, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing on this episode, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode as well as previous episodes that you can use in your conversations with friends and family and that you can share on social media. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. Glen, I want to pick up where we left off and now kind of transition into what is the state of the news media industry today. it is an industry that wields awesome power and also has tremendous responsibility. And given your career, I mean, you worked for more than 20 years in the broadcast industry in Idaho, Wisconsin, Colorado, Utah. I think I got all those states right.
All of them.
But you've done weather, sports, news, political reporting, sort of political dialogue. I've always had a love for the journalism industry. That was initially where I was going to go in my career, and spent a brief amount of time in the broadcast news industry for a local NBC affiliate, and then doing some political reporting for a university paper. So I always have loved the news industry, but at times, since I have not worked in that industry for most of my career, have felt frustrated with what feels like some challenges in the industry.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of, the market of the industry itself, but it living up to sort of its role and its responsibility. And so I want to kind of ask you first, can you give us just a quick summary of what your experience was like in the industry, and what were some of the things you learned over those 20 years? And then let's transition into talking about the responsibility of news and maybe where there might be some valid critiques.
So I'll start off by saying it's pretty jaw-dropping how much the industry changed from when I got in to when I left. I, at the beginning, would not have even been able to foresee what was coming. It has changed that much. Mainly just in the way it's staffed and delivered. Way fewer people in a newsroom now than before. That obviously puts more responsibility on each and every one that is in the newsroom. So you're doing multiple things as opposed to being able to focus on turning, maybe just one quality story per day. And it's different depending on the position, but just the way it's evolved and the way it's changed over the years. Obviously, there are a lot more choices now. We saw cable news networks obviously come in and chip away at the local media. Social media, the rise of that has changed the way media is and the digital aspect of it. It's just completely different than it was at the time I got in.
And I guess what have you learned about the way Americans consume information with respect to political or policy issues, and how have you seen that change, and has it changed for the worse?
So I think a lot of it is generational. There was a generation that grew up watching television news. Those in that generation are the ones that are still mostly watching it. But there's this newer generation now that obviously just gets their news on their devices. So there had to be a really big shift in the way news organizations focused, and they had to learn, how to get that message out in different ways. And they're still continually trying to do that and to master it and to be effective. But a lot of that in the way you consume your news, I see as generational. So when we think about the role of the news media and the responsibility, what would you say, again, as a 20-year veteran? It's an amazing career in an industry that I love, and an industry that's vitally important, but an industry that, again, it's easy to feel frustrated with, especially if you work in the policy political space. What do you view as the core responsibility of the news industry to Americans? So I came up in the old school days of journalism. The responsibility was to hold the powerful accountable, government officials and others, and to be fair and factual about it. Those are really important things. My philosophy was always there are multiple sides to every story. You collect those sides, you present those sides, and then it's up to the viewer to decide how they're going to view it and what they're going to believe about that. But it's just essential to get the facts straight, to be fair and to be balanced. And ultimately, as the role of a journalist is in that balance, that estate that we talk about is to hold the powerful accountable. And we've seen many examples of that over the years where that has happened. And it still happens today, I do believe, just at a different scale.
So do you think there's been a decline in sort of the scope or the frequency with which the news media generally fulfills that core responsibility? Have they kind of started to shift away from that? We need to hold power to account. We need to be fair and honest and accurately report things that are factual. Has there been a trend away from that in recent years, in your view?
Yes, but there are still some organizations that are dedicated to doing that and that still do a good job of that. It goes back to what I talked about. There are fewer and fewer people doing the same and even, you could argue, more work. So obviously from a resources standpoint, that wears thin and contributes to what we're talking about. But some organizations are very dedicated and have investigative units still that they're putting money into and they're putting time and effort into. And so you do still see that at some scale.
I want to ask you about sort of media trust and media bias. And as a reference point for our listeners, there's a gentleman named Yuval Levin who works at American Enterprise Institute and has written a book called A Time to Build, where he talks a lot about a lot of the survey data showing a serious decline in trust in institutions. And it runs the whole spectrum. It's Congress, it's business, it's churches, and it also includes the news media. And I want to mention a couple of stats. One, when you look at, so this is Gallup and Pew have both done a lot of survey work on this. Gallup in particular, when you look at Americans' trust in mass media, and we'll include these links in the show notes for our listeners too, but the chart that I'm looking at now that we'll link to, back in 1998, it was in kind of the low to mid 50s as far as percent of Americans that trusted mass media. It took a serious dip in 2016 and went down to 32%, went up a little bit in the subsequent years, and recently, as of 2020, had settled kind of around 40%. So the broad trend line is showing a decline, but there's a dip around a contentious election in 2016.
Yeah, I think that's pretty explainable.
How do we explain it?
Well, we're all familiar with former President Trump and how he and his relationship with the media. It was adversarial. He was very open and he was very open about his distrust for the media. And I think he would talk about that on a regular basis. And obviously he has a base that follows him and listens to him. And I think a lot of that can be explained through that. There's one point I want to make on that though, real quick. There has become a gray line between punditry and media. And you can attribute a lot of that to the rise of cable news. We say cable news, but a lot of the cable news networks are not about news. They're about an echo chamber. They're about serving a certain demographic or a certain political party. And so there's become this blurred line between what really is media and what isn't.
How much of that, I guess, dip in trust either during major election cycles that are contentious or sort of this overall decline in trust over the decades, how much of that can you, again, just in kind of your assessment, attribute to newsrooms sort of acting differently? And I'll preface that with even some of my own experience just as a news consumer, looking at the 2016 election cycle, for example. There were news outlets that I, in my journalism school years when I was young and in my early, relatively brief experience in the industry, looked up to immensely as this is kind of the gold standard of factual, fair, honest, objective journalism. And even some of those outlets, from my perception, seem to become a little bit more, politically polarized, or what I perceived as bias. Mm-hmm. And so I guess, yes, there are political actors that can influence sort of the media landscape and the media dialogue, but do you think they, bear some of the responsibility as well? Are the forces of political polarization also tugging at the news industry?
I think so. Of course, I can really only speak to the local level. And, my objective every day was to leave my personal belief at the door. But I do have a personal belief, obviously. I will say over my career, there were times where I would see pieces from partners that would be sharing partners with, would probably be the best way to describe that, where I thought, yeah, that's probably a little bit on the bias side. That's the way you're wording this comes from the way you see the world. So I think there definitely is some of that. I think on the local level is where they do, and where I always was, and where they still continue to do a better job of really keeping your own bias out of a story and telling it the way that it's supposed to be. But I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't certain journalists that maybe do allow their personal thoughts and biases in their work, because I've definitely noticed that.
Speaking of bias a little bit more, there's some additional data points I want to mention, again, from that same Gallup survey that we'll link to. But when Gallup tried to break out Americans' trust in mass media by political party, and this is, again, from 1998 to 2020, so that kind of same year range, back in the 1990s, 41% of Republicans trusted the news media, 64% of Democrats. So you see kind of that split. And our listeners, when you go to our website and see this chart posted, you'll see that kind of gap between Republicans and Democrats, where Democrats tend to trust the news media more than Republicans, is pretty consistent through the 90s and 2000s. But then it expands in the early 2000s. And again, it takes a serious hit in 2016, and now the gap is much wider, where as of 2020, according to this data, only 10% of Republicans had a great deal or a fair amount of trust for the news media, and it was 73% of Democrats. So should we interpret that as there's a very intense perception of bias among politically affiliated Americans, and how much of that perception is grounded in reality versus how much of it is just driven by our political polarization?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can take a look at that and try to argue that's not the case. Obviously, if you're Republican and conservative, you tend to have less trust in the media. And, this is anecdotal and not scientific on my part, but I would say that in my experience, I also noticed that Republicans tended to have less faith or trust in the media. So that obviously is set on a perception, and it's pretty easy to draw conclusions on what that is.
Well, one other thing I want to ask you, then we'll go to our another break real quick, but is essentially this recognition of we talked before about the responsibility of the news media. This Gallup data as well shows that very, very strong majorities of Americans recognize that a healthy and present news media industry is really vital to American democracy. If we want a healthy, functioning republic, we need a news industry. So it struck me as interesting that there's almost these sort of converging or conflicting data points. Is if a lot of Americans are saying, well, I don't really trust the news media, and maybe a lot of them are saying, I think they're politically biased, but we also really need them in our country. How do we reconcile those two things? Yeah. And is there a way to bring that into harmony?
I mean, that's obviously a big problem. When you take a look at those two factors, when you can sit and say this is needed, but I'm not happy with the way it's happening. I do think we see a lot of echo chamber media. I think people feel more comfortable where they're hearing what they want to hear. But again, I just keep going back to this idea that there are locally sourced journalists who are doing it for the right reasons, who are fair, who are balanced. And you can find that. It is out there if you're willing to look for it.
And I want to underscore that as well. In some of my past work, I did government PR in a couple different capacities. And again, the Utah Press Corps, I think, is good. It's nice being a Utahn because there's a lot of things we get to brag about. We have a good economy. We have a well-managed state. We're higher for volunteerism, quality of life. I don't know if there's an official metric as far as how good your local press corps is, but if there was, and if there is out there, I would assume and expect that Utah would rank high for the reasons that you said.
There's a very dedicated press corps covering politics here in the state of Utah and other issues for that matter. I keep going back as we have this conversation to something I heard Governor Cox encourage people to do not too long ago, and that was to turn off cable news. Again, it kind of goes to what I was talking about. There's this blurred line between what is media and what it isn't, and there's a lot of media, or there's a lot of punditry, I should say, trying to dress themselves up as media these days.
So it seems like being able to sort of, as a news consumer, understand and recognize the difference between, who are the actors, the institutions that are really focused on healthy, true journalism versus kind of maybe activism. That's an important point. And also, again, recognizing the high number of quality journalists here in Utah that I really think we're blessed with, that we have a good press corps here, but then transitioning that into, okay, what can we do as a state, as a country, as a society to maybe improve some of these things?
Well, for one, we can seek out, as you alluded to, those who do it right and do it fair, but also share their work instead of someone you don't really know or someone you know comes from a line of bias. It seems like a lot of us are just willing to share anything, whether it's true or not, without really doing the research behind it.
I want to dive in a little bit more in our last segment, discussing with you about some of those things we can do as news media consumers and as a society to help to continuously improve an industry that's vital to the country, that does a lot of great work, even if there are some areas for improvement, and also public discourse in general. We need to have that back.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to it.
So we're going to take a final break and then come back with our conversation with Glen Mills. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and my guest this week has been Glen Mills. He's a 20-year veteran of the broadcast news industry, a former anchor and political reporter and show host, and we've been talking with him about the state of public discourse in the country, as well as the health of the news media as an industry. Before we continue our conversation, I want to mention if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google, essentially any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. So Glen, as we round off this conversation about news and public discourse, I want to first ask, in the realm of trying to improve things in our society, if you could magically get every newsroom in the country to do one thing differently starting tomorrow, what would it be?
I think it would be to invest in long-term journalism. And what I mean by that is allowing reporters to focus and to dig and to give them the time needed to do it right, as opposed to demanding it be turned in one day.
And is there anything that you would say to a news media consumer, all the listeners now out there that consume news, they watch videos, they read things, if you could get all of us as consumers to do one thing differently, to be more responsible news consumers, what would you say?
Know the difference between punditry and media. Seek out trusted, reliable media sources. Listen to their work, patronize their work, and share their work as well.
Well, when you think about sort of general shifts, we've talked a lot about sort of the trend lines over the years of public discourse in the news media. Are there any other things that come to mind that you think of as that we as a country, these are the things we ought to do to make our news industry more healthy and overall more committed to its core responsibility? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Well, just similar to what I said is, we've gotten to a society where we're like a click society. We need our clicks. We need to make sure we're grabbing attention. And when that happens, a lot of the important boots on the ground type of work suffers because of that.
How do you think some of that, I like the sort of boots on the ground work kind of perspective, because it really does convey this idea of sort of embedding yourself in a community or in an issue. And in some ways, that's a lot of the work that we do here at Sutherland Institute and other similar think tanks, trying to really dive into an issue to develop depth of expertise and understanding, to then share ideas and principles and data on that issue in a way that can elevate the debate and help shape our public conversations.
I keep coming back to this, but that's what local news is all about. People who work in local news live in this community. They want what's best for it, just like anyone else. And, they understand their role about getting information out there. And that's a really important difference as well, are the roots that are built here locally.
How do you think some of those shifts on the local or the national level with that kind of, more robust journalism, how do you think that would help heal or improve our national debates? And again, I don't mean specifically presidential debates, although yes, we'd love for those to be improved, but just the way we discuss issues as a people, as Americans. How can can those trend lines in the positive way help us become better at public discourse?
Well, we're seeing efforts like we have brought up already locally with the governor and his Disagree Better initiative. I was actually in a embargoed meeting with the governor well before that initiative was launched with a number of other local reporters. And by the way, I had that story done probably like 2 months in advance, which was pretty much unheard of in my career. But it did draw a lot of attention. Every local media outlet was there covering that. That's a really important effort because you're right. At the top, it's hard to control the narrative and people are going to say what they're going to say, and we've seen that. But you can make differences from the bottom, and hopefully it'll start to infiltrate and make their way up to the top as well.
I want to ask you, we've got a couple minutes left, and one of the questions I want to ask is this idea of debate being an art form. It's a skill set. And it's something that I love and enjoy and view as important for a healthy, functioning country. And my wife teases me sometimes that I love good discussion more than almost anything else. And it's not only is it fun, but it seems so important for how we cross differences, for how we articulate ideas and try and win people over, but move forward as a country to make a difference on issues. Do you think the art of public debate is something that can be regained and restored as a national norm? What's your level of optimism for that?
I think it can be. It's not like we've never been in this situation before. I would encourage anyone listening to read about the election of 1800. I read a fascinating book. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. It's called The Magnificent Catastrophe. It goes over the election between Jefferson and Adams. And you will be blown away by the parallels you'll notice from 2020 and 1800. It's all there, I'm telling you. You're probably thinking, no way, that's not even possible, but it is all there. From changing the rules just before the election through state legislatures, questioning results of the election, echo chamber media. So as a country, we've been there. There are obviously a number of other times in our history we can point to where things were very divided. You can't be more divided than the 1860s in a civil war. The civil rights movement. There have been a lot of times where our country has been divided, and we take a look at what's happening now, and it's easy to look at that and say, wow, this is the worst it's ever been. But our country's been there before, and it's survived moments that I would suggest are even more divisive than we are now. And I do have optimism for our country that we can improve the discourse and we can be respectful of one another.
Well, Glenn, I think that's a good note to end on, because on this show, we often talk about some of these issues that can be frustrating or challenging, but we don't just want to leave folks with negativity. So I appreciate you kind of giving this dose of optimism. And in recent years, there have been a number of messages like that. You know, folks saying, if you look through our history, there are examples of times where things were pretty bad and we came out okay. That doesn't mean that we necessarily know exactly the right steps to take now to fix everything. We hope we'll figure that out. But just this general sense of optimism and faith in the American experiment that we've been through some tough things, we've been through some similar things, but we know we can come out on top because we've done it before. Mm-hmm. So I love and appreciate that sort of injection of optimism.
Yep, I definitely believe that there can be better days ahead, for sure.
Well, we want to appreciate you lending your time and expertise to this, and thanks for your work as a journalist committed to these ideals of public discourse over your 20-year career, and best of luck in your new endeavor with the State Department of Corrections. So we'll still see you in the communication space, the policy space, as a person here in Utah trying to make a positive difference. So,
yeah, heading up to the Capitol right after this.
Well, enjoy. I'm sure we'll rub shoulders at times up there.
Good.
Thank you, Glenn, so much again for your time.
You bet.
Well, we have one more final break before we leave you with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas, and thanks so much for listening today. Before we close the episode, I want to share a few final thoughts. There were a number of good takeaways from that conversation with Glenn about the state of the news media industry and public discourse today. Captured a few notes that I want to share with you because I think it'll help improve our discussions just generally on political and policy issues, and also help improve each of us as sort of consumers of news media. First off, I think it's important to point out that it might feel really easy to be critical of the news media for what we perceive to be political bias. But what we sometimes forget is that you and I, as news media consumers and as citizens, we also have a role in strengthening how we all discuss issues in this country, political and policy issues. So we can recognize bias when it exists, but also never forget our own role and responsibility in contributing to a healthier way to discuss these issues. So here are some talking points that we captured from this episode to kind of help improve how these issues are discussed and covered in this country, and try to restore free and open and robust debate on issues. So number one, I want you to think of your own news media consumption habits. Be aware of what in your media diet is really true fact-based journalism compared to things that are influenced more so by activism or partisanship or trying to sort of offer perspective-based journalism. That's a skill set that sometimes takes time to develop. When you do that, be able to articulate the difference between facts and perspectives when you're sharing that content or when you're discussing it with friends and family. That'll greatly enhance your conversations about news coverage of these issues. And as part of that, be willing to prioritize consumption of content that offers reasoned debate and coverage of issues rather than content that simply stokes anger or fear or division. And I think we'll sort of see and feel the difference between those kinds of content when we encounter it online or over the airwaves. Number two, in your own conversations, try to model a more productive way of discussing and debating issues. And what that could look like is, first, when you speak with the goal of earnestly sharing your own principles with the spirit of inviting the person you're talking to sort of see the value in those principles that you believe in deeply, but then listen with the goal of genuinely learning something about the other point of view that might interest or even surprise you. I think this will better equip you to be able to articulate the things you believe in a more effective way that invites the person to learn from you and maybe even adopt some of the things you believe. And you might also learn something from somebody else that might surprise you or interest you, as we said. At the end of the day, we need a really healthy news media industry in this country committed to true journalism, and we each have a role in helping that come to pass. But we also need a citizenry who honestly seeks for true discussion in their own media consumption habits. So look for content that models the kind of dialogue worthy of this great country. We hope that this episode has helped you feel better empowered to defend some of the ideas we talked about today, in particular the need for healthy, robust, true debate of issues. It's a value we should all share and should all strive for. If you like this episode, we hope you visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also find all the previous episodes and clips that you can share on those issues as well. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, you can do so on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, on Google, essentially any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. You can also watch the full episode on our YouTube channel as well. And also, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.